Regardless of how you feel about the attempted censure of Robert Graham back in 2016, this isn't about that. This is about the process. The process is important because the process is the grassroots, the conservatives, everybody's way of making sure that their opinions are heard and respected. And it also demonstrates just how important it is to know the rules when you're participating in meetings at the party level. So, a bit of background, there were two factions at the time. There was the establishment faction and the conservative faction. The conservative faction was a bit displeased with leadership and they wanted to express that somehow. The Arizona Republican Party bylaws actually provide a way to do that. They actually provide for removal of an officer. And it says, and I quote, "An elective officer of the state committee may be removed at any time by a vote to that effect by the membership of the state committee." That's our bylaws, Article 4, Section D. I think they presumed that that was a little bit too harsh. They didn't want to remove anyone. They wanted to express their displeasure in another way. And the way that became apparent was, of course, the censure. So a censure resolution was drawn up, and the plan was to introduce it at the mandatory meeting back in 2016. Now, how does one do a censure? Robert's Rules of Order has very clear guidelines for how to get that done. If you look at the chapter on disciplinary procedures in Robert's Rules, page 643, it actually says how to do a censure. Basically, it says just make a motion. Quoting, "It is also possible to adopt a motion of censure without formal disciplinary procedures." You make a resolution, you move it, and if it's adopted, you've got your censure. That's very clear in Robert's Rules of Order, and it's not just on the chapter on disciplinary procedures, it's throughout the document. Pages 137, 175, 451 all show examples of how to do a censure without any disciplinary procedures. So that was planned for the floor at this mandatory meeting. Now, let's watch and see what happened when they did that. One thing before we start, you should recognize the chairman, Robert Graham, is not presiding at this meeting. The Arizona Republican Party bylaws give him the right to designate somebody else to preside for him, and that's what he did. That's Article 4, Section F, Paragraph 1 of our bylaws. Quote, "The chairman shall preside unless she shall designate someone to preside in his or her stead." So Robert Graham designated this particular presider to preside for him over this part of the meeting. So let's watch and see what happened.
Is there a motion from the floor for the Robert Graham censure? In the microphone. Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Parliamentarian, I make a motion that the full resolution that qualified be heard by the body, the censure against Robert Graham.
I second.
Okay, listen to me carefully. With regard to this matter, the chair rules as follows.
Now listen carefully to what he's about to say. He is going to rule the motion out of order, and we're going to see that what he's saying is completely and totally irrelevant. Remember, we saw Robert's Rules of Order. We saw the guidelines on how to do a censure. No formal disciplinary procedures are required. That's clear. It's undisputable. But watch what this presider actually says next.
The motion did receive the proper number of required signatures to be brought from the floor. However, Chairman Graham is a member of this body. Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, states the following. Punishments that a society can impose generally fall under the headings of censure, fine, suspension, or expulsion. Since this resolution seeks to censor Chairman Graham, the procedures for disciplinary procedures would apply.
No, they would not apply. The procedures for disciplinary procedures do not apply. It's clear. It's black and white. It is the rule. In fact, they wouldn't even apply if the motion was to remove an officer, let alone merely censure an officer. So what you're going to see in the next few minutes is a lot of completely irrelevant gobbledygook by this particular presider. Now, I'm going to refute each and everything that he says, but it's not necessary because it's all irrelevant anyway. If you're not interested in seeing those details, feel free to skip ahead several minutes in this video to the end where I get to the conclusion so you can see what happened at the end. So again, feel free to skip ahead if you're not interested in the details that I'm about to get into with this particular presider. What I'll do is I'll put up a picture of a gavel on the screen so you can scan right forward, and when you see this gavel again, you'll know to stop and you can watch the end of the video. Okay? See you then. Okay, you're still here, so good. Let's get into the details now. Let's take a look and see what he says next.
In Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised, it states on page 256 that a member or officer has the right that allegations against his good name shall not be made except by charges brought on reasonable ground. If thus accused, he has the right to due process, that is, to be informed of the charge, given time to prepare his defense, to appear and defend himself, and to be fairly treated.
No, he doesn't in this particular case because it's only a censure. But even if he did have the right to those things, number one, he was informed, right? The resolution was put out a week before the mandatory meeting. Number two, that whole week was time available to prepare for it. And number three, to appear and defend. He was presiding at this particular mandatory meeting and certainly was there in order to defend himself. So all three of those requirements are met anyway, even though they weren't necessary. Let's continue.
It also states that the society has the right to investigate the character of its members and officers, and as may be necessary to the enforcement of its own standards, but neither the society nor any member has the right to make public any information obtained through such an investigation. If it becomes common knowledge within the society, it should not be revealed to any persons outside the society. Consequently, a trial must always be held in executive session, as must the introduction and consideration of all resolutions leading up to this trial.
Sure, a trial needs to be held in executive session. That means it needs to be held in secret. But a trial doesn't need to be held in the first place. So again, this is more irrelevant nonsense. He's quoting here, continuing to quote from the chapter on disciplinary procedures in Robert's Rules of Order, in this case, page 655. Let's move on.
It further states that it is, if improper conduct by a member of society occurs elsewhere than at a meeting, which is what this would imply, the members may have no first-hand knowledge, and therefore, if disciplinary action is to be taken, charges must be preferred and a formal trial held before the assembly or before a committee, standing or special, which should be required to report its finding and recommendations to the assembly for action. In addition, even when improper conduct occurs at a meeting, in order for disciplinary action to be taken other than promptly after the breach occurs, the charge must also be preferred.
Did you get that? That's okay, because it's irrelevant anyway. It has no bearing on the present situation. That's quoting from page 649 in Disciplinary Procedures. Ridiculous, meant to intimidate rather than to educate. Let's continue.
The proper method of censoring an officer would be to initiate a committee to investigate the veracity of the situation, and if the committee found merit to prefer charges against the officer, prefer those charges. And if charges were preferred, the officer would then have sufficient time to prepare a defense, and then a trial would be held. All of these are necessary steps according to the parliamentary authority, and is designed to protect the rights of the individual member, which cannot be suspended even by a unanimous vote.
All these are necessary steps, he says, according to the parliamentary authority. False. They are not necessary steps, and you can tell me why. You already know. In fact, I'm sure you can quote me the exact page number of the reference that states those are not necessary steps. Page 643. It is also possible to adopt a motion of censure without formal disciplinary procedures. If the conservative faction had instead moved to remove the chair from that leadership position, the bylaws specifically state that it could be done with a simple motion. Again, an elective officer of the state committee may be removed at any time by a vote to that effect by the membership of the state committee. So even removing the chair doesn't require what he's saying here to do. Again, let alone just merely censuring. Okay, let's move on.
Based on this information, the chair rules this motion out of order because the action violates the rights of an individual member to due process and may subject to the body to charges of libel.
Libel. Well, I'm no lawyer, but even I know that being convicted of libel against a public figure is very difficult. Much more difficult than libel against anyone else. And also, forget about that, it's the membership's choice. It is the membership of an organization that has the authority to decide whether they are willing to accept that risk and make the decision as to whether to proceed with whatever action would incur a potential lawsuit. That's a principle known as majority rules that applies to voluntary organizations such as the Arizona Republican Party. So let's look at the big picture here. The presider, designated by the chair, is ruling the censure out of order because the chair is threatening a lawsuit. You can't make this stuff up. Let's continue.
Since there cannot possibly be two interpretations of this ruling because it's straight out of the parliamentary authority, there can be no appeal to this decision.
There cannot possibly be two different interpretations. Watch out. When you hear that, you know that somebody is playing parliamentary games. What they're trying to do, what he's trying to do, is invoke an obscure rule in Robert's Rules of Order that would serve to make an appeal of his decision out of order. This is an attempt to shut down the appeal. He's going to rule this thing out of order, and it's going to be appealed, or it should be appealed. He knows that. But he can't let this get to a vote, because if it does, who knows? The conservatives might win. So instead, what he does preemptively and declares there cannot possibly be two different interpretations of what he just said. Fine, because what he just said didn't apply to the situation anyway. Remember, we know what page it's on. No disciplinary procedures are required. Okay, done discussing all those gory details. Gavel is up. Welcome back if you decided to skip over the details of this analysis. Now, let's take a look and see what happened right after the presider ruled the motion out of order. Fooled again. Nobody appealed, nobody knew how, or that they could even do such a thing. And so the decision stands. If you looked at the assembly there, it was hard to tell. Maybe half the people were applauding that the resolution was ruled out of order. Maybe half weren't. Hard to tell for sure whether it would have passed or not. When it comes to an organization like ours, it's best to let the vote happen so that the will of the majority can be recognized. Preventing the will of the majority to be expressed by a vote is unconscionable. It's not something that we should stand for. I, as a parliamentarian, wouldn't stand for it. My strong suggestion is A, learn the rules, learn the basics of Robert's Rules of Order. It's not hard. B, send an experienced person who's willing to fight for these issues for you to the RNC. I will represent your principles there, and I have the ability and the tools to be able to do so. As you may know, the national committeemen that we elect in this election will take office after the conclusion of this current presidential nominating convention in August. That's fine, because Mr. Trump is going to get our enthusiastic endorsement. The Trump train can't be stopped, even by the establishment. They're going to be quiet this year. We're going to get our nominee into nomination again. However, in 2024, he is going to be termed out. And I can assure you, the establishment is going to be out in full force trying to oppose conservative candidates and promote establishment ones, just like they did against Trump in 2015. Let's not let that happen. Your national committeemen can be influential at the state level also. I will advocate to the best of my ability for all the things that matter to us. Closing the primaries, holding our elected officials accountable, stopping electronic voting, and limiting proxies. These and other things need to have some support at the highest levels. They don't seem to have that support now. Put me in the position of national committeeman, and I'll do my best to try to get him there. Thank you very much for your support. I hope to see you soon, and together, let's make the grand old party grand again. See you soon.